You might know this show by another name. Specifically for Seniors was where it all started. A place built on the idea that people who've lived have a clarity that's hard to fake. That's still true. That's still us. But the conversation got bigger. The audience got wider. And the cynicism, turns out it's pretty universal. So we evolved. Same sharp eye, same refusal to nod along. Just a bigger table. Welcome to the Enlightened Cynic. You're in the right place. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Enlightened Cynic. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Barsh. What if the most profound consequence of sending humans to the moon and Mars isn't the science, the geopolitics, or the engineering, but what it does to us, to our bodies, our DNA, our species? That question is exactly where our guest lives. Dr. Scott Solomon is a biologist and teaching professor at Rice University, a research associate at the Smithsonian Institute, and one of the most electrifying science communicators out there. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, National Geographic, and Wired. He's been on NPR, the BBC, and ABC News, and he hosts his own podcast, Wild World with Scott Solomon. His 2017 book, Future Humans, tackled where evolution is taking us here on Earth. His new book goes much further, literally, Becoming Martian, How Living in Space Will Change Our Bodies and Minds, landed from MIT Press in February, just weeks before Artemis II sent humans back toward the moon for the first time in more than 50 years. Scott, I'm so excited to talk with you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Scott, your bio mentions that you teach evolutionary biology. I was a biology major in college many years ago. That subject wasn't available. What's your work in the field of evolutionary biology here on Earth?
Well, my training as an evolutionary biologist was actually very focused on ants. So it's a long stretch, perhaps, to go from studying ants down in the rainforests of Central America, as I've spent a lot of time doing, to thinking about humans on Mars. But I actually was fascinated by ants initially, in part because they remind us of ourselves, right? I mean, ants live in actually pretty complex societies, and they do a lot of things that we used to think only humans do. Like, they have a division of labor within their colonies that allows them to, be pretty sophisticated in things like how they construct their nests. And they do that without any kind of, blueprints. There's no, general contractor sort of telling them where to dig. And, they're really kind of like amazing in how much they can accomplish in such simple ways. They even have agriculture. The ants that I was studying are growing fungi in their underground nests as a form of agriculture. So that was my initial interest, was not just understanding how they behave, but reconstructing how they came to be that sophisticated. So trying to work out the evolutionary history of the ants and the other organisms like those fungi that they're growing that they've come to be so dependent on.
Long stretch to Mars.
It is, although, one of the things I always point out is if we're really going to live on Mars, we probably have to live underground because, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but there's a lot of radiation on the surface of Mars. You really want to be protected from that. Going underground is one of the best ways to do that. So it may end up being that if we're living on Mars, we're living much like ants. We might have to have these complex networks of, tunnels and underground, habitats, basically a giant ant colony underground on Mars. So, hey, I could always connect the dots.
Now, along those lines, the other night at dinner with a friend, he asked why spend money on space flight and a Mars base? Wouldn't that money be better spent on Earth? What kind of research could you get that just can't be done here?
I
How
think it's
would
a
you
really
answer him?
yeah, it's a question I hear often. I think it's actually a really important question. And I think first of all, we have to be clear that if the only benefit that comes from this kind of work, research effort is what happens out in space, then it might not be the best use. But I think what we see when we look back through the history of space exploration and human space flight is that when we go to space, when we figure out the technologies and the innovations to be able to go to space, it ends up benefiting us here on Earth in all sorts of ways. And there's all these figures that you can find on like the what is the return on investment, for every dollar spent in space. There's however many times that amount that benefits people here on Earth. So there's that notion that like yes, there will be benefits to us here on Earth, but I actually, I would also think about it from the perspective of, um, you know, if we don't go, what is the cost? And everybody has different motivations for why they think human space exploration and in particular space settlement, which is what I've really been focusing on, like living on other worlds. Why would we want to do that? Some people think that this is just a great adventure. Others see it as, purely a scientific endeavor. Others see, profits to be made. But the motivation that really kind of resonates the most with me, and by the way, these are not like, you don't just have to pick one. Like it could be more than one of the above, right? But the thing that really I think strikes me as ultimately something that we have to take seriously is that if we don't do that, if we always remain here on Earth, then we are more vulnerable as a species, right? Humanity has all its eggs in one planetary basket, so to speak, and that means that if there's ever a disaster here on Earth, that it could spell doom, right? And so that's one of the, to me, most compelling motivations for going is the idea that we increase our chances of long-term survival by becoming multiplanetary. Now, it doesn't mean we have to do it tomorrow, right? So we could talk about what's the timeline by which we should be doing this, but that to me is the thing that I think justifies a lot of the investment in a future beyond Earth, because ultimately life as we know it might depend on it.
Survival of the species as a whole.
That's right. And you could even make the argument, as some have, that it's not even just humans, it's Earth life. It's all life that we know of. That we have not yet, found life beyond Earth. It may exist out there. I, for one, think it's likely that it does. But you know, if it's true that Earth life is unique and that there isn't anything like it elsewhere, and we had the opportunity to not only go ourselves, but to bring other forms of Earth life with us, which by the way we would do whether we intend to or not. But even if it's just the bacteria on our skin, like we're bringing stuff with us. Plus we have to eat something, so we're going to be bringing plants and other things to eat. But it's we are the only species currently that is capable of extending Earth life beyond Earth. And so some people have argued that we actually have a moral obligation to try to ensure the long-term survival not only of human life but of life with a capital L, Earth life as we know it.
In case there's no other life anywhere in the universe.
In case there's no other life, and in case some disaster would befall, and even if befall us here on Earth, but even if there is life elsewhere, it's possible that that life is fundamentally different. It may have come about separately through an independent origin of life process, and it might be very, very different from Earth life. So life on Earth might be unique, not just in the sense that it's the only life, but it might be the only version of life that is what we are familiar with.
You had a piece in the Washington Post beginning of April, the ripple effects of NASA's Artemis mission. Um, the moon and Mars could create a new human species, you argue. Um, what did you mean by this?
Yeah. So basically, the point that I try to make in that article, which is really sort of like the main thesis also of my new book, is that we should expect that if humans leave Earth to live elsewhere, as we were just talking about, that will lead to evolutionary changes. Basically, everything that we know about how evolution works tells us that anytime you take a small number of individuals and you put them into a new environment, and especially if that new environment is someplace very isolated, very far away, and if the environment there is quite different from where they came from, that is a recipe for evolutionary change. And we understand that process quite well from studying things like islands here on Earth. Think about the Galapagos Islands and how they inspired Charles Darwin, and the reason why biologists like me continue to return to the Galapagos Islands and other islands to study and understand evolution. So, my argument is that if we go and if we truly live out there on Mars or anywhere really that is an isolated place out far away from Earth with a different environment from Earth, that we should expect that future generations living there will become different from those that first arrive there, that first establish that population, and that eventually they will likely evolve into new human species. So it's possible that if we don't just go to Mars, if we keep going as some would like us to do, that you could eventually end up with kind of this diaspora of human species kind of spread out among the cosmos. It's very much sounds like a science fiction scenario, but it really follows from what we understand about how evolution works.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that a little bit more later on, but
Sure.
your new book, Becoming Martian, follows Future Humans, your first book, which looked at where evolution is taking us right here on Earth. How did that book lead to this book? Was it
Mhm.
evolutionary?
It was a natural evolution. That's right. I mean, it kind of was. So with future humans, yeah, you're right. Future humans really looks at like, are we still evolving today? And it was actually something that came out of my classroom teaching at Rice University, where I teach students about evolution. And one year I asked them if they thought humans were still evolving, and we had this great discussion in class about, well, what do we actually know about this? Are humans evolving, and how is like modern life affecting our evolution? And I was emphasizing that evolution is not only natural selection, that is one mechanism of evolution, but that there's other ways in which we evolve. And, things like the movement of individuals from one place to the next, we call that gene flow. And it's a mechanism of evolution. And so that's still happening. And in fact, that mechanism, the movement of people around the world, that's actually happening at a higher rate today than it has ever happened in our history, as human migration is made so much easier because of our transportation technology. So yeah, so that book really kind of ended with just kind of glancing into the future. I mean, most of the book is about evolution happening today in the 21st century, as we are living today. But I wanted to end that book by looking into how we might evolve in the future. So the last chapter of Future Humans considers different scenarios for what our long-term fate as a species might be. So I looked at extinction. That's a possibility. I looked at the possibility that we just kind of stay as we are indefinitely, which I actually think is very unlikely, in part because no species has ever accomplished it in the history of life on Earth. And then lastly, I looked at, well, could we evolve into a new human species? And I pointed out in that book that, what we understand about how that process happens is that it's most sort of like, it's basically the easiest way to get new species is to physically separate individuals from one species so that they can no longer come together and have babies. And so that is a recipe for speciation. That's why islands are such great hotspots for evolution. And as I point out, well, we're sort of doing the opposite today. We don't really have human populations that are completely isolated in the 21st century from other human populations. And so it would take something different for that to happen in the future. Something like if some humans left Earth and went and lived somewhere else on another planet like Mars. And I even considered that scenario in future humans. And I pointed out that, yeah, I mean, that probably would be a recipe for, taking a very different evolutionary path. But at that time that I wrote that book came out in 2016, so 10 years ago now, and it didn't really seem like a very likely scenario, for at least not for any time soon. But then soon after that book came out, and I was going around and giving talks about it and doing interviews, and soon it became clear to me that there are actually people that are quite seriously working on that. And there were things like SpaceX started having some pretty big advances in their rockets that are designed to take people to Mars and to stay. And NASA started announcing their plans for kind of having a more permanent human presence in space. So all of that led me to just decide, you know what, that little kind of thread that I began in the end of Future Humans, I think I want to follow that and explore it in more detail. And that's what Becoming Martian is.
Who were these books written for? Scientists or the public or what?
No, I really wanted to make these books accessible to the general public. So, something that I really became passionate about as a graduate student really was the idea of sharing science with everyone, right? Like as a scientist, I do write research articles that go into journals that a handful of experts are going to read if you're lucky, and that's important. That's how science proceeds. We need to have that system, but at the same time, there's just so many people that are never going to read those articles, and some of them will get picked up by science journalists or the news, kind of mainstream media, but the vast majority never do. And so I decided as a kind of a young scientist that I really wanted to make an effort to share science more broadly, and it's really become a big part of what I try to do now. We're actually at launch. I'm helping at launch. Excuse me, at Rice. I'm helping to launch a new Center for Science Communication and Public Engagement, where we're trying to help to train students to be able to do that kind of science communication for the public, because I think it really is important. I think we need that in society, and historically, it hasn't been a part of the training and education for most scientists. So yeah, these books are really meant to be accessible, interesting, engaging, not just for other scientists who I'm told enjoyed them as well, but really for anyone who's interested.
So let's get into the science a little bit.
All right.
What's happening at the genetic and epigenetic level that isn't making the headlines? How does space flight uh, alter the human body? And let's start basically by defining the difference between genetic and epigenetic for the listeners.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So basically, when we're talking about genetics, genetic changes, we're talking about changes to your DNA and specifically to the sequence of DNA. And so, with DNA, this is the code for how to make an organism, right? So it's the alphabet basically, which consists of A's, T's, C's, and G's. Those are the four letters of the DNA alphabet. And the order of those letters basically is an instruction code that tells the body, make this protein. And that is what then goes on and does all the work of the body, basically allows us to live, build our bodies and function the way we are intended to. So if you change that sequence, it can result in a change in the structure or function of the body. We are generally given our DNA code by our parents, right? We have our, half of our mother's and half of our father's DNA, and they make a unique combination that makes us. So, when we think about sort of like, the genetic changes that could take place in space, what we're talking about is something that doesn't normally happen to us here on Earth. We generally think that like the DNA that you're born with is pretty much going to be the DNA you have for the rest of your life, except that there are some ways that it can change. And if you have a mutation, which is like a change in the sequence of your DNA, right? That's something that can be problematic because it can interfere with the function of your body. And specifically, we think about like carcinogens are things that cause cancer. Well, what are they doing? Well, they're specifically changing the sequence of your DNA in a way that causes that cell to turn into a tumor, which of course can be problematic. So that's why mutations are things that we tend to be concerned about because we associate them with cancer. But they don't have to be, right? So mutations can also be just sort of like, not really any big deal. Just sort of depends on the specifics of the mutation. So one of the things that's been fascinating is that what we've learned is that going to space can cause mutations. It can change the sequence of your DNA. And the first time that we really sort of definitively showed this was with the NASA twin study. This was when astronaut Scott Kelly, who spent a year on the International Space Station, agreed to have all sorts of tests done on him before, during, and after his year in space, including taking blood draws so that scientists could sort of monitor these types of things. And then, part of what made it fascinating and why it's called the twin study is Scott Kelly has an identical twin brother, Mark Kelly, who now senator from Arizona, but at the time he was also an astronaut, except Mark was going to be on Earth. So they decided they'd do all the same things with Mark on Earth that they were doing with Scott in space. So doing all the same blood draws and everything. So what this was able to do was show that Scott Kelly's DNA changed during his year in space. It was different from how it was before his flight, and it was different from the DNA of his identical twin brother, Mark, who otherwise has the same DNA as Scott. Now, why does it change? Well, this is because being in space, you are being exposed to a lot more radiation than we are here on the surface of the Earth. So, there's all different forms of radiation, including, like x rays when we go to the doctor or the dentist and we put the lead apron on when we're getting the x rays. That's to protect our bodies from the potentially harmful effects of radiation because, again, it can cause mutations, which could lead to cancer. And so, being up in space, you are in an environment where you're being exposed to much more radiation. And the reason for that is that the atmosphere of the planet is actually blocking a lot of that radiation that exists in space. This is radiation from the sun. It's radiation from other galaxies, what we call galactic cosmic rays. And so being up in space for a year literally changed the sequence of Scott Kelly's DNA. But you asked about genetics and epigenetics. So far, I've been talking about genetics. Epigenetics is something that we've only started to understand relatively recently in the last few decades. And the idea with epigenetics is that it's possible for the body to change the way genes and DNA function, not just by changing the sequence of A's, T's, C's, and G's, but by basically changing when those DNA sequences are actively doing their work, actively being converted into the proteins that do all of the work of the body. That's when we talk about a gene. A gene is something that is performing a function. And not all the genes are always doing that. You can turn them on and you can turn them off. And one of the ways you can do that is, for example, by adding other chemicals to the DNA that basically like shuts them off or causes them to be activated, turned on. So those types of changes, like adding these extra chemicals that turns genes on and off, that's something that we call epigenetics. And we now also know that it can be heritable. That's one of the key things, is that changes that happen to us as adults, if they are, turning our genes on and off, that is actually in some instances something that could be passed on to your children. And so, that's partly why people are sort of fascinated by them. That's partly why we want to like understand them better. And we did see in that NASA twin study that Scott Kelly's DNA had epigenetic changes that happened to him in space. This is probably not due to radiation, or at least not only due to radiation, because we know that any kind of stressful situation that you experience can cause your body to turn certain genes on and off through these kinds of epigenetic changes. So it's unclear so far, like what specifically about being in space caused these epigenetic changes to Scott Kelly, but we did see them. But here's the biggest difference, and then I'll stop because this has been a long answer. But okay, so the genetic changes, the changes to the sequence of DNA that Scott Kelly experienced, those are permanent. That's not going to ever go back to the way it was when he comes back to Earth. The epigenetic changes can be reversed. So when he comes back to Earth, we do see some of those epigenetic changes being sort of undone. So I think that's an important distinction to make as well between genetic and epigenetic changes.
Do we know if humans can successfully reproduce in space?
Ah, yes. This is a very important example of something that we really don't know very well. So, we have learned a lot about how the human body is affected by space. So, my long answer about genetics and epigenetics is only one tiny slice of that. What we have not really done much research on is reproduction. And this is something that when I was researching the book, I was really kind of struck by like how much of a blind spot this seems to be in our understanding of um, human biology in space. And it's not that we know nothing, but we've done very few experiments that are specifically looking at aspects of reproduction. So the short answer, I'll try to keep this one much shorter. The short answer is we really don't know. There are some of these experiments that have suggested that reproduction might not be too severely affected, but there are enough experiments that basically have shown issues arising that give us pause. But the part of the problem is so few experiments have been done that there aren't enough for us to be confident about those conclusions. So we really need a lot more research on that topic.
And even after that, Mars has about a third the gravity of here on Earth. What is the birth process like?
Yeah, so if we're really serious about living on Mars or anywhere else beyond Earth, we need to not only understand like how does fertilization, embryo development, pregnancy, how does all of that get affected by the conditions there, which include higher radiation and lower gravity, right? But we also need to understand, like, yeah, how is childbirth affected by it? And then child development as well. Like, what happens to a kid that's born there? So, the short answer, again, is that we don't know because nobody has done this. There have been some experiments on rats conducted in microgravity and in zero G, basically, up on the International Space Station and its precursors, the space shuttle and some of the earlier space stations, but very little. And so the short answer is we don't know. I argue in Becoming Martian that we should really be concerned about this because specifically about childbirth, because we know that childbirth is risky. It's risky here on Earth, right? I mean, women die in childbirth, unfortunately, all the time. This is not like uncommon even here on Earth. And so if we're looking now at somebody who has been in a lower gravity environment for some amount of time, maybe their whole life, one of the things that we know happens to people in a lower gravity environment is their bones start to become brittle. They become weaker. Basically, without gravity pushing down on your body, your muscles get weaker. And because bone responds to muscle, then your bones weaken as well. And some of the bones that have the most weakening are the hip and the pelvis. These are, some of the bones that help to support our weight. And so it kind of makes sense that if your weight is lower, that they're going to be most severely impacted. But at the same time, those are bones that, if they fracture during childbirth, could be some of the most devastating in terms of the risk to mothers, and in turn to their to their children. So I think the possibility of women experiencing complications in childbirth in a lower gravity environment is something we have to really take seriously, and something that we just don't know enough about.
You draw a parallel between um, what people who settled on Polynesia uh, islands are like and those that might settle on Mars. Could you discuss that just for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that we can think of the planets basically as like islands, right? You have an isolated landmass that is sort of surrounded by a long stretch of inhospitable terrain, right? I mean, that's basically what an island is. And so I try to make the point in the book that we can think about well, what do we understand about evolution on islands, and apply that to what could happen to our own evolution on planets. And as we were talking about earlier, I argue that we should expect evolutionary change and the evolution of new species on those islands in the in the solar system. But then you could turn around and say, well, wait a second, humans once lived on all of these different islands scattered across the planet, right? The very first humans that arrived in some of these islands were isolated for long stretches of time. Why didn't they evolve into new human species? And the Pacific in particular is probably the best example that we have, because yeah, the Polynesian people, the ancient Polynesians, were really the world's greatest navigators. I mean, they found just about every island that exists in the Pacific, and were able to establish settlements there, and they set out not knowing where they were going, and finding these places, and then bringing all the things they needed with them in order to establish a settlement. Um, and so, I think it is a really interesting parallel, and other people have made this comparison in the past as well. So why did they then not evolve into new human species? Well, I think there's two important factors to consider. One is the amount of time that they were isolated. And if you look at what we know about the timing of the settlement of the Pacific now, based on a combination of archaeology and genetics and even linguistics, there's a lot of different data that has kind of been combined to reconstruct the timing of this. And it turns out that it wasn't really all that much time that passed, a few hundred years at most, between the settlement of some of the most remote Pacific islands, like, say, Easter Island, and when the first Europeans arrived, the early explorers like Captain Cook, who explored this region. And that's relevant because soon after the first Europeans arrived, more Europeans arrived, and they started moving people around from island to island. So that isolation period kind of ended. So a few hundred years in human generations is not actually that many generations. So as an evolutionary biologist, we tend to think in terms of generations, because evolution is defined as change over generations. So it's not really the number of years that matters, it's the number of generations. So a few hundred years is only, a few dozen human generations at most. So that's actually not that many generations. But there's another factor. The other factor is, how isolated were they? I mean, you look at a map of the Pacific, and you look at some of these islands, and you have to imagine that anybody living there before they had kind of modern technology couldn't have been in regular contact with anybody else. But actually, we have evidence now that seems to suggest that they were. So there's, in particular, archaeological evidence and some genetic evidence that suggests that they had trade networks that existed that allowed at least some individuals to actually move back and forth from one island to another. In many cases, there were a few islands like Easter Island that do seem to have been quite isolated, but most of them actually did engage in trade of goods with other islands, even those quite far away. And as we know from history, anytime people exchange goods, they have often exchanged genes as well. So, that they weren't even that genetically isolated for all that much time. So the parallel here to space is to say that, look, if we're living on Mars at some point in the future, it will matter how often we are sending spaceships, rockets back and forth between Earth and Mars. And, if we're exchanging goods, are we also exchanging genes? The more that we do that, the more that we exchange genes in particular, the less likely it will be that people living on different planets evolve to become different. So I've said that that's what we should expect. We should expect evolutionary change. But it also matters how much contact there is between people living on different worlds. The more contact, the less separation and evolutionary change we should expect.
Does that affect the choice of people who are sent to Mars? It's a small population.
The choice of people matters a lot, and this is another lesson from evolutionary biology, which is, the founders of a new population in a new place have a huge effect on that population moving forward, because whatever traits, whatever genes they happen to have, are going to be what is kind of present in that population, and the amount of genetic diversity in that founding population is incredibly important for the future success of that population. The more genetic diversity, basically, the more resilient, the more adaptable that population is going to be. Genetic diversity is incredibly important for evolution. It's the raw material that natural selection uses to allow a species to adapt to its conditions. And as the conditions are changing, you need that variation for natural selection to work. So
So it's,
yeah.
sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it really matters who you send, and you really want to send the most diverse founding population possible if you're trying to set those folks up for future success.
So it's not only their abilities, um, their work on a new colonization.
Yeah.
It's also their biology that matters.
That's right. And this is where, we're going to have to think differently from how we've thought about, selecting astronauts in the past. If you think about, the history of how we've chosen who gets to go to space, going back to the early days of human spaceflight, this idea of, the right stuff, as the author Tom Wolfe put it, it's not just about who's the best pilot or has the best skills at all this incredible variety of things that astronauts have to do. Yes, that's important, of course. Also, being able to get along well with the crew, that's a really, really important skill that NASA and other space agencies really, really pay a lot of attention to, rightly so. It'll be that, and also their biology, because if you ignore their biology and, for example, get a very genetically similar group of very highly skilled individuals, they might do great initially, but future generations will suffer if there isn't genetic diversity present, because they will not be able to adapt to those conditions as effectively.
So how long would it take? How many generations would it take to develop at least the start of a new species?
Yeah. So let's talk about the time frame. So I have to admit, as an evolutionary biologist, I'm guilty of thinking on much longer time frames than most people are. So when I'm like, oh, it won't take that long, like just a few hundred years. And people are usually like, what do you mean? That's a long time. Like, well, yeah, I guess in a human the kind of like lifespan, that is a long time, but by evolutionary standards, that's a blink of an eye. I do think it will happen faster on Mars in space than it would here on Earth. That's what I'll say, because of a number of factors. One, anytime the environment is very different, it causes evolution to go more quickly. Basically, natural selection is stronger if any individual that happens to be a little bit better at surviving in this new environment, like any advantage they have becomes a really big advantage, and so those traits tend to spread faster. And of course, the environment on Mars is dramatically different from any environment on Earth. Even the most harsh, extreme places on Earth, like Antarctica, are cozy compared to what Mars is like. Let's be clear about that. And the other thing, though, is how much genetic variation do you have? If we are wise about this and we start off with a genetically diverse founding population, that would be ideal. That would help them to evolve more quickly. But at the same time, you will also be acquiring new mutations through radiation exposure, right? We said before, like being exposed to radiation causes mutations. Those mutations can be harmful, but if they're not, every now and then you get a mutation that gives you something useful, something beneficial, something helpful. And because Mars doesn't have a thick atmosphere like Earth does. Its atmosphere is less than 1% of Earth's atmosphere. So that's not blocking a lot of the radiation. And then the other thing that Earth benefits from when it comes to radiation is we have a magnetic field that surrounds our planet called the magnetosphere. And that is blocking, trapping a lot of radiation from space as well. So we have kind of two things working in our favor on Earth. Mars has no magnetosphere. So the space radiation is hitting the surface of Mars at nearly full strength. So anybody on Mars that's spending any amount of time on the surface is being exposed to a lot of radiation. So that's why I think we'll have to go and live like ants underground. But I also think people are not going to be satisfied to just stay underground all the time. I know I wouldn't be. So I don't want to go all the way to Mars just to live in a cave. So if people are spending any amount of time on the surface, they are going to be exposed to radiation, and that is the raw material, that mutation, that genetic variation is that raw material for natural selection. So if you've got both increased amount of genetic variation and very strong natural selection, that's a recipe for rapid evolutionary change. So I've argued that in as few as 10 generations we might see pretty dramatic evolutionary changes in human populations living on Mars. um, that is still, we're still talking maybe, 250, 300 years. But again, from my time perspective as an evolutionary biologist, that's pretty quick. So yeah, these things are hard to know with any certainty, but I think the applying what we know about how evolution works on Earth and applying what we know about the environment on Mars and how space affects the human body, there are some things that we can say, and part of what we can say is that if we go there, we will change.
What's the likelihood that these people who are born and grow up on Mars could ever get back to Earth?
This is something that I think we need to really take seriously because, some of the things we've already talked about, like the risks of childbirth, the harsh environment of being there, and the fact that future generations are likely to adapt and to be different. I think that there is a really, you know, a real possibility that people on Mars would have a hard time coming back to Earth. If you think about future generations having adapted to the conditions on Mars, and that includes adapting to the lower gravity, about one third that of Earth. If you're coming from a place if you're coming from Mars that has one third gravity and you come to Earth, all of a sudden on Earth, you will weigh three times what you weighed back on Mars. So just imagine suddenly weighing three times what you weigh. And now imagine doing that with weakened bones, right? I mean, that could be a really dangerous type of situation. And it's not just the bones; it's also the muscles. It's also your heart. I think this is actually something that it could be harder than what we normally think of. And the other thing that I think has not necessarily been given enough consideration is the immune system, right? Our immune system is trained to fight against the microorganisms, the infectious diseases that we encounter in our lives. And as we are exposed to any kind of bacteria or viruses, we develop resistance to them. We build antibodies. Like this is why you don't tend to get the same illness more than once, right? And so it's why vaccines work. So um, here's the thing: on Mars, the only microorganisms, the only infectious diseases that we'll be exposed to are going to be the ones that we bring with us. And we will bring some with us, hopefully not many. I think we can easily avoid some infectious diseases like malaria. If we can prevent mosquitoes from boarding our rocket ships, then we can, wipe those out. But other things will inevitably come with us because we all carry bacteria and viruses in and on our body. Um, some of those might evolve to be new infectious diseases. But whatever they are, the things that are on Mars are going to be a tiny subset of all of the infectious diseases and all the microbes here on Earth. So a child born on Mars and growing up there who comes back to Earth will all of a sudden be exposed to all of these different infectious diseases, including, microbes that aren't normally harmful to us here on Earth but could be harmful to somebody who had never had any exposure to them. So I actually think the infectious diseases and the immune system could be one of the biggest things that limits our ability to easily move between planets, and something that I just think hasn't really been given enough consideration in the past.
A sort of war of the world scenario.
That's exactly right. I mean, H.G. Wells thought about this way back in 1898 when he wrote War of the Worlds. And that was the one thing that stopped the Martians with their superior technology from invading Earth, right? Was they had no defenses against our bacteria. So, yeah, he was ahead of his time in so many ways.
Uh, is there anything else we missed? Well, I'm sure there is. Uh, but anything else you'd like to bring up?
Well, I guess one thing that is another, thing that I write about in the book, and I think is worth thinking about, is we do have some technologies that we could use now to kind of help us to adapt to the conditions on Mars or elsewhere in space. And I'm talking about genetic technologies, the ability to edit our DNA with things like CRISPR. This is a tool for going in and making very precise, deliberate edits to our DNA. And we know how to do that. It's being done in some cases. It's being used for some clinical treatments for diseases like sickle cell disease. So in theory, we could do that and basically edit people's DNA to make them better adapted to the conditions on Mars. And that would really jumpstart the process of being adapted to the conditions there. But of course, it comes with a lot of ethical concerns, a lot of kind of moral dilemmas. For one thing, there's the possibility that it leads to unintended consequences, right? That's a real concern. If you're editing people's DNA in a way that's heritable, like you make an edit to one person's DNA and then all of their children, grandchildren, and so on inherit that change, that means we are taking evolution into our own hands. There's a lot of concerns about that. And then there's also the possibility that if we edit someone to be well adapted to the Martian environment, it could be at the expense of being well adapted to Earth. So we might have to make choices about, how important is it to be able to really survive and thrive on another world versus having the flexibility to go between planets. And that's something that I think, we need more than just biologists to be thinking about these questions. These really are ethical questions that I think are at least as important as the science.
Okay, one sort of silly thing that I want you to comment on. Is there a president on an alien planet who may at this moment be warning that humanoids from outer space are going to be visiting their planet?
Yeah, well, I mean, you say it's a silly thing, but actually, it brings up like this idea that who are we to go and take over another world, right? Like, it's one thing if we go to a place that we know has no life on it, and so far, we don't know of any life on Mars. There's evidence that there may have once been microbial life on Mars. We don't know that for sure, but it's looking increasingly like that may be the case. We have not yet found any evidence for current life on Mars. But if we did find that there was living organisms on Mars today, I think it would really change the whole conversation, because then you have to ask, like, is it ethical for us to go and interfere with, life on another world, right? So I was talking about, like, why it might be beneficial to Earth and Earth life and humanity. But what about if you turn it around from the perspective of those that are already there, right? Is it does our benefiting by increasing our odds of survival, does that outweigh the potential cost of, the impact that we would be having on life elsewhere? Now, people would also probably make a distinction between microbial life versus intelligent life. If there was intelligent life there, then it really gets to be complicated, right? So yeah, if we ever get to the point where we do discover that there is life elsewhere, boy, I hope that happens. That would just be incredibly exciting. Um, Slightly terrifying too, but but also quite exciting. But it really changes the nature of the conversation. Um, and I'll just point out that actually there are international treaties in place that basically stipulate that we are not to interfere with the biology of other worlds. Basically, there's this notion of planetary protection. So NASA, for example, has people employed as planetary protection agents whose job it is to make sure that we are not accidentally contaminating other planets with Earth life. And at the same time, their job also involves trying to make sure that if there is any life out there, that we're not accidentally bringing it back here to Earth. This is why, like, the Apollo 11 astronauts, when they first came back from the moon, they went into quarantine, because at that time we weren't certain that that they weren't bringing back any kind of moon diseases with them, right? And that would have been potentially devastating. So now we think that's very unlikely, but still, like, if we go to another planet like Mars or elsewhere, who knows? Could be. So there is actually a framework in place to try to prevent exactly that scenario of, like, contaminating another planet with Earth life, whether that planet has just microbes or has something more complex. But I'll just point out, if we're talking about space settlement, if we're talking about going and living on Mars or anywhere else, we're basically throwing out that idea of avoiding contamination, because there's no way for us to go and live there without contaminating that world. I mean, we're there, but also all of the microorganisms in and on our body, the plants and maybe animals that we bring for food. We have to have an entire ecosystem in order to survive, and so we have to bring that ecosystem with us if we're to have any chance of surviving there. So, yeah, it's a real thing. Like, we have to think about these questions of, what are the rights of aliens, of life on other worlds, and how do we weigh their rights against our own interests? It's a fascinating topic.
Sort of a reverse Men in Black phenomenon.
That's right. That's a good way to put it.
I'm going to ask you the last question you pose in the book. Given what we know, should we humans leave Earth?
Yeah, so you're right. It is the last sort of thing in the book, and in part, I sort of struggled with, do I make my own opinion about this clear from the beginning of the book, or not? And I chose to kind of wait until the end, and I just sort of wanted readers to be able to make up their own minds as we're kind of going through and exploring together. But yeah, I do reveal at the end of the book that, spoiler alert, if you want to read it and not here, then maybe pause this and come back to it after you finish the book. But I do basically share my opinion at the end, which is that um, I think that eventually we maybe should be doing that. Like, I think that argument that I described earlier, that if we don't become multiplanetary, it could mean that we eventually become extinct, and that perhaps, Earth life could also, eventually be destroyed. And so that seems like a strong argument for going and settling.
It's a comment from my producer.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That, speaking of Earth life, yeah. So all species of life on Earth. Although I do point out in the book that there's reasons why we might not want to bring our pets with us, but that's a controversial take. But anyway, I basically point out that I don't think we're ready. That's really my conclusion. Is I think eventually we should prioritize living on other worlds, but there's enough things that we don't know, that we don't fully understand, like, human reproduction, like whether a child born on Mars could come back to Earth, right? To me, we need to know those things before it makes sense for us to move forward with plans to actually settle there. So until we have those answers and answers to a few other important questions that I point out in the book, I think I think we should move forward with doing research, but I don't think we're ready yet to actually start, loading up the rockets with settlers who are planning to go and move to Mars. So yeah, it like I said, I wrestled with whether I should share that opinion early in the book or late in the book. I chose to kind of save it till the end, but it was my kind of inescapable conclusion after all the research I had done.
Scott, what can I say? This has been fascinating. It's been educational. It's been fun, despite what the producer had to say at the end there. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun for me too.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. Take care.
That's our show for today, and we're glad you were part of the conversation. If you enjoyed what you heard, hit subscribe and share it with a friend or family member who'd appreciate a little sharp thinking and hard-earned perspective. Until next time, I'm Larry Barsh, reminding you that experience matters, perspective is earned, and this conversation is just getting started. The Enlightened Cynic. Take care, everyone.